Hi there. If you're here, you're probably looking for two things: a little history and a lot of sleep. So lie back, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillow like it owes you money, and let me take you back to a time when mornings smelled like goats and afternoons felt like an eternal sunburn. A time when showering was an annual event and the dental hygiene involved twigs. Yes, we're going to the Viking Age, that historical period between approximately 793 and 1066 CE, that your history teacher probably romanticized, but was actually about as comfortable as wearing wool underwear in a sauna. Tonight, we'll explore why your 9 to 5 job, with its air conditioning and relative lack of sword wounds, is actually paradise compared to life as a Viking. So close your eyes, relax your shoulders, and prepare to drift off to the soothing sounds of historical discomfort. Chapter 1. The Viking Age, a time you've probably imagined as epic voyages, fierce battles, and flowing golden hair waving dramatically in the wind. A world filled with muscular warriors, with horned helmets, sailing bravely into the unknown, discovering new lands, winning eternal glory. Well, let's pause right there. First of all, no horns. Sorry to burst your bubble. The only horned helmets Vikings wore were invented by costume designers centuries later, probably to impress opera fans who needed their Vikings to be just a little bit extra. Those iconic horned helmets first appeared in Wagner's Ring Cycle in the 1870s, nearly 1,000 years after the Viking Age ended. Real Viking helmets were simple, rounded affairs, often just leather with maybe some metal reinforcement if you weren't living paycheck to paycheck in 9th century kroner. And most people didn't even have those. Helmets were expensive. Think of them as the Viking equivalent of designer handbags, status symbols that most regular folks couldn't afford. In fact, the reality was much less cinematic and much more uncomfortable. Life in the Viking Age was less like an exciting adventure novel and more like an endless camping trip, minus the marshmallows and bug spray, but definitely with extra mosquitoes, and not modern camping with Gore-Tex and lightweight titanium gear. We're talking about the kind of camping where your tent is made of animal skins that still smell faintly of their previous owner, and your camping stove is a fire pit that fills your living space with smoke because proper chimneys were still centuries away. Imagine waking up every single morning on a bed made from straw and animal pelts, discovering that your neighbor's goat, again, decided your living room was preferable to the yard outside. And this isn't a cute, Instagram-worthy pygmy goat that does yoga poses. This is a full-sized, ill-tempered beast that has absolutely no respect for personal boundaries and has a particular fondness for eating your left shoe and only your left shoe, leaving you with an increasingly bizarre collection of right shoes that you can do nothing with. Your days would be filled with manual labor, hard, gritty, relentless, not the kind of exercise that gives you the satisfaction of reaching your step goal on your fitness tracker. No, this is the kind of labor that leaves your hands calloused, your back perpetually sore, and makes you old by 30. By the time you hit 40 in the Viking Age, you'd be considered almost supernaturally ancient, with younger villagers wondering what dark magic keeps you alive and if you might be some kind of witch. If you're lucky, you'd have a little salt to season your food, making everything taste only slightly less bland than cardboard. Pepper, unheard of. Cinnamon, that's worth more than gold. Your culinary adventures would consist mainly of variations on a theme of boiled, boiled meat, boiled grains, boiled roots, occasionally interrupted by the exotic alternative of dried. The Viking Age diet makes modern military rations seem like Michelin-starred cuisine in comparison. And let's talk about that housing situation. Your home would be what real estate agents might generously call rustic charm. A single-room longhouse shared with multiple generations of your family, plus livestock. The centerpiece would be a fire pit that filled the space with smoke because proper ventilation was still a distant dream. The smoke would eventually escape through a small hole in the roof, but not before making your eyes water and depositing a fine layer of soot on everything you own. Your furniture would consist of rough-hewn benches and chests that would make IKEA's most basic offerings look like the height of luxury and ergonomic design. Romantic ideas about Vikings being clean, hygienic, and stylish. Let's be real. Bathing was a special event, not a daily routine. Your spa day would be dipping briefly into an icy stream, screaming quietly to yourself and calling it good for the week. The English chroniclers of the time actually complained that Vikings were unusually clean because they bathed once a week, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval hygiene standards in general. It's like being called a neat freak because you occasionally remember to change your socks. Brushing your teeth, you'd be chewing on a twig, hoping desperately it wasn't used earlier by someone else. Dental care consisted mainly of waiting for problematic teeth to fall out on their own, or if you were in a hurry, having the village strongman yank them out with primitive pliers while everyone gathered around to watch the entertainment. Toothaches weren't just uncomfortable, they could be deadly in an age before antibiotics. An infected tooth could lead to blood poisoning, making that presentation you're dreading at work seem rather trivial in comparison. And forget about toilet paper. Just forget about it. I won't go into details, but let's just say moss, leaves, and your left hand would become very important to you. And now you understand why eating with your right hand was so strictly enforced at mealtimes. Speaking of which, there was no germ theory, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. People just knew that sometimes you got sick, sometimes you got better, and sometimes you didn't. The concept of washing your hands before preparing food would seem as alien to a Viking as the concept of sending a text message. Yes, it's true. Vikings explored vast oceans and discovered distant shores, but most Vikings weren't conquering warriors. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen who spent their days worrying less about epic battles and more about surviving harsh winters and hoping their sheep wouldn't wander off again. For every legendary berserker charging into battle, there were hundreds of ordinary Norse people just trying to coax crops from the stony soil and wondering if they'd harvested enough food to survive until spring. The romantic image of Vikings as fearless explorers sailing the open seas hides the reality of what those voyages were actually like. Picture yourself on a wooden ship open to the elements, with no navigation equipment beyond the stars and the sun when visible, no toilet facilities beyond over the side, and no fresh food or water after the first few days. Many Viking sailors died from scurvy, dehydration, or simply falling overboard in rough seas, never to be seen again. And seasickness, there was no Dramamine, just the misery of your body rejecting the very concept of ocean travel, while your fellow sailors laughed at your weakness. So, as you drift closer to sleep, gently adjusting your comfy blanket, let that sink in. Your modern-day annoyances, a bad Wi-Fi signal, lukewarm coffee, or slow delivery, might not seem so terrible when compared to a day filled with mud, manual labor, and goats. Always goats. The Viking Age goat was somehow simultaneously everywhere it shouldn't be, and nowhere to be found when you actually needed milk. They were the cellular dead zones of the ancient world, frustratingly unpredictable, and always at the worst possible moment. Now, get ready, because in the next chapter, you'll get to live exactly one day as an ordinary Viking. Spoiler alert, you might prefer your day job. Even that passive-aggressive email from Karen in accounting doesn't seem so bad when the alternative is defending your vegetable garden from both raiders and rabbits with equal ferocity. Chapter 2. A day in the life you wake up. It's dawn, and the rooster outside sounds like it's auditioning for a horror film, not the gentle cock-a-doodle-doo of children's books, but a guttural, primal screech that suggests this rooster has seen things, terrible things, and is determined to share its existential dread with everyone in a 5-mile radius. There's no hitting snooze on this living alarm clock. The rooster has spoken, and your day has begun, whether you're ready or not. The bed beneath you, really just straw and animal skins, is not doing your back any favors. Your spine feels like it's been rearranged by an enthusiastic but unqualified chiropractor. The animal skins, despite their rustic charm, harbor a thriving ecosystem of fleas, ticks, and other tiny roommates who have been feasting on you all night. That itching sensation, it's not psychosomatic. You're literally being eaten alive in microscopic increments. You rise stiffly, stepping carefully over siblings, cousins, and maybe a goat or two who decided to spend the night indoors. Privacy? That's a funny concept here. The entire family, grandparents, parents, children, infants, all sleep in the same space. Every cough, snore, and nocturnal bodily function is a shared experience. If someone has gas in the middle of the night, it's everyone's problem. Your personal space extends approximately 3 inches from your body, and even that's negotiable if the winter is particularly cold. As you stumble to your feet, you notice the distinctive smell of Viking morning breath, a potent combination of last night's fermented fish, poor dental hygiene, and whatever mysterious bacteria have been cultivating in the warm, moist environment of unwashed mouths. It's not just your breath, it's a collective miasma that hangs in the air like an invisible cloud of olfactory assault. You step outside into the crisp, painfully cold morning air. The temperature is somewhere between uncomfortable and why do humans live here? Your breath forms clouds in front of your face, and your nose hairs freeze instantly, giving you what feels like tiny icicle daggers in your nostrils. No toothbrush, no minty freshness. Instead, you're chewing on a birch twig, hoping to freshen breath that has already offended half the village. The twig does almost nothing, except perhaps redistribute the bacteria in your mouth to new and exciting locations. Washing your face involves splashing icy water from a bucket, hoping it doesn't freeze on contact. The water comes from the nearby stream, the same stream where people wash clothes, water animals, and occasionally relieve themselves when the designated waste pit is too far away in bad weather. Water purification consists of hoping that whatever might kill you has settled to the bottom of the bucket. Breakfast is simple. Porridge again. It's bland, grainy, and suspiciously crunchy. Is that sand? Probably. Is it a small pebble? Maybe. Is it something much worse that you don't want to contemplate too deeply? Absolutely possible. You eat around the mysterious hard bits and focus on getting calories into your body. Spices? Forget them. Salt is your entire spice cabinet, and even that is used sparingly because it's valuable. Your daily luxury might be a bit of salted fish. If you're lucky, the fish has been preserved in a way that makes it almost unrecognizable as something that once swam in water. But protein is protein, and you can't afford to be picky. Your clothing is itchy wool, rough, uncomfortable, and not exactly flattering. It's heavy, cumbersome, and definitely smells like last week's work. The wool comes from local sheep, processed by hand, which means it retains much of its natural lanolin and sheepy aroma. It's also not particularly color fast, so your body has a slight bluish or reddish tint from the plant-based dyes that rub off on your skin. Fashion statements are less about style and more about not freezing to death. Layers are your friend, even if they make you look like a walking textile experiment gone wrong. Shoes, if you have them, are simple leather affairs that provide minimal protection from the elements and none at all from stones, thorns, or the ever-present animal waste that dots the village pathways like a fecal minefield. Many people go barefoot when the weather allows, developing calluses thick enough to make modern podiatrists weep. Your feet, constantly damp and rarely clean, are breeding grounds for fungal infections that have no names yet, but will be intimate companions for most of your life. You spend your day laboring in the fields, chopping wood, or repairing homes, hoping your tools won't break and your strength won't fail. Modern jobs have occupational hazards. Viking occupations have death hazards. A broken tool isn't just an inconvenience. It could mean the difference between eating next winter or starving. Agricultural techniques are primitive at best, consisting mainly of put seed in ground, pray to various gods, hope for the best, Crop rotation is practiced, but understanding of soil chemistry is non existent, meaning yields are unpredictable and often poor. If you're a woman, your day includes all the household tasks: cooking, cleaning, child rearing, textile production, from spinning wool to weaving cloth, food preservation, and often helping with the farming or fishing as well. The idea of women's work versus men's work exists, but the luxury of strict division of labor is often impossible when survival requires all hands on deck. For men, fishing isn't the relaxing pastime of sitting in a boat with a cold beverage, occasionally reeling in dinner. It's battling treacherous seas in open boats, hauling heavy nets by hand, and knowing that a storm could send you to a watery grave at any moment. Hunting isn't sporting. It's desperately trying to bring down dangerous animals with primitive weapons because your family needs the meat to survive. One wrong move, and that boar you're hunting will disembowel you faster than you can say, "I miss modern emergency medicine." Lunchtime comes and goes with dried meat and stale bread, washed down with questionable ale that's probably more hygienic than the water. The ale isn't the refreshing craft beer you might enjoy at a modern pub. It's cloudy, room temperature, and has bits floating in it that you choose not to examine too closely. It's not strong enough to get you drunk, just enough to make the water safe to drink by killing most of the harmful bacteria. The bread is dense, dark, and occasionally contains small rocks from the millstone that ground the flour. Dentists haven't been invented yet, but if they had, they'd make a fortune replacing the teeth broken on Viking bread. The afternoon drags on with more labor, more discomfort, and the constant awareness that slacking off isn't an option when survival is at stake. Modern work stress involves deadlines and performance reviews. Viking work stress involves complete these tasks, or winter will kill us all. It's a powerful motivator, but does little for your work-life balance. As the day wears on, you notice the various small injuries you've accumulated. Blisters on your hands from tools, a splinter the size of a small spear in your thumb, mysterious scratches on your forearms, and the persistent ache in your lower back that's been your constant companion since you turned 25, which, in Viking terms, means you're approaching middle age. None of these injuries warrants special attention. They're just the daily tax your body pays for existing in this time. Evenings offer a brief respite. Stories around the fire, where humor is dark, jokes grim, and tales filled with battles, bravery, and bizarre superstitions. Entertainment doesn't come from Netflix or social media. It comes from the village's best storyteller, embellishing tales you've heard 100 times before, but still enjoy, because what else are you going to do? There's no TV, no books, unless you're exceptionally wealthy or religious, and board games consist mainly of Hnefatafl, a strategic game similar to chess that you always lose to your irritatingly smug cousin. The firelight casts long shadows as mead or ale is passed around, slightly stronger than the daytime variety. This isn't the smooth, refined alcohol of modern times. It burns going down and sits in your stomach like liquid fire, but it does take the edge off the day's pains and makes the endless genealogical recitations of who's related to whom seem almost interesting. Almost. Conversations revolve around practical matters. Who's marrying whom? Often arranged for practical alliances rather than love. Which fields are yielding well? Whether Thor is angry about something specific or just generally displeased with humanity, and speculation about raids or trading journeys planned for the summer. Politics isn't an abstract concept. It's very literally which powerful family is feuding with which other powerful family, and whether you might get caught in the crossfire despite your best efforts to remain neutral. Finally, exhausted from a day of constant physical labor and with nothing but a smoky hearth for light once the sun sets, you collapse onto your uncomfortable bedding, ready to repeat it all tomorrow. Your dreams are a chaotic blend of daily anxieties, crop failures, livestock deaths, and the ever-present specter of violent raids from neighboring settlements or distant enemies. In the distance, a wolf howls, reminding you that humans aren't the only predators in this world. You pull your rough blanket closer, ignoring the itching it causes, and drift into fitful sleep, knowing that the rooster will wake you all too soon to start the whole process again. And so passes another thrilling day in the life of an average Viking. No epic battles, no glorious deaths worthy of Valhalla, just the grinding, relentless work of staying alive in a world where nature is actively trying to kill you for about half the year. Chapter 3. Life isn't just uncomfortable, it's fragile. Disease runs rampant, injuries are common, and medical treatment involves herbs, superstitions, and possibly leeches. If you get sick, your options are limited. Tough it out, or hope Odin is feeling generous. Modern medicine has made us forget how terrifying ordinary illnesses used to be. That common cold, in the Viking Age, it could develop into pneumonia, and without antibiotics, pneumonia was frequently a death sentence. The concept of germs doesn't exist. Disease is attributed to imbalanced humors, evil spirits, or the displeasure of the gods. That cut on your hand, rather than clean it with antibacterial soap, you might pack it with moldy bread, which ironically sometimes worked as a primitive form of penicillin, though no one understood why. Or you might have a village elder chant over it while waving chicken bones. Infection was so common that the Norse had specific gods for healing, like air, who were constantly petitioned to intervene when wounds inevitably festered. Childbirth, a dangerous prospect even with modern medicine, was downright terrifying in the Viking Age. Women giving birth would invoke Frigg and Freya, hoping for protection, but maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Many women died delivering their 5th or 6th child, leaving their older children motherless in a world with no social safety net beyond extended family. The concept of a blended family wasn't some modern phenomenon, but a necessary survival strategy when death constantly reshuffled family units. Dental issues were particularly nightmarish. Without proper dental care, cavities would grow until the pain became unbearable. The treatment, sometimes extraction without anesthesia, sometimes cauterization of the gum with a hot metal rod, sometimes packing the cavity with various substances including honey, which has antibacterial properties, herbs, or even mouse droppings, which definitely do not have antibacterial properties. Tooth abscesses could and did kill people regularly, the infection spreading from the jaw to the brain with nothing to stop it. Mental health issues existed but weren't understood as such. Someone suffering from depression might be considered touched by dark spirits or simply weak-willed. Psychosis or schizophrenia might mark you as either cursed or blessed, depending on how your symptoms manifested and whether your ravings seemed prophetic or just disturbing. Treatments ranged from exile from the community to being revered as having special connections to the gods or spirit world. Either way, actual helpful treatment was non-existent. Then there's slavery, common, accepted, harsh. If you're captured in battle, your new job description is suddenly much less glamorous, and freedom becomes a distant memory. Slaves, or thralls, as the Norse called them, were considered property, not people. They had no rights, could be bought and sold at will, and were often treated worse than livestock because animals were expensive to replace, while capturing new slaves just required a successful raid on a neighboring settlement or distant shore. Some thralls were born into slavery, the children of slaves inheriting their parents' status. Others were captured in raids or taken as payment for debts. A bad harvest or two could force a formerly free person to sell themselves or their children into slavery just to survive. Once enslaved, your life expectancy dropped dramatically. The archaeological record shows that thralls often had signs of malnutrition, healed fractures suggesting physical abuse, and died younger than their free counterparts. Sexual exploitation of slaves was common and accepted. Female thralls had no right to refuse their masters, and any children born of such unions typically remained slaves, though occasionally a master would free his offspring. Male thralls were not exempt from sexual abuse either, particularly those captured from exotic locations who might be seen as novelties. The possibility of manumission, being freed, existed, but for many, it remained an unattainable dream. Some thralls managed to buy their freedom, if allowed to keep a portion of their earnings from crafts or other skills, but this could take decades. Others might be freed as a reward for extraordinary service, or as part of their master's desire to appear generous before the gods upon their deathbed. Still, many lived and died in bondage, their bones eventually buried in unmarked graves, their stories untold, and their suffering unrecorded, except in the most clinical archaeological evidence. Religion rules your day-to-day life, filled with gods who demand sacrifice, omens that cause anxiety, and rituals that seem oddly specific because offending Thor is a bad career move. The Norse pantheon wasn't composed of distant, benevolent figures. These were capricious, powerful beings who took a very active interest in human affairs and needed constant propitiation. Your crops failed? Perhaps you didn't sacrifice properly to Freyr. Your child is sick? Maybe Frigg is displeased with your household management. That unexpected storm that sank 3 fishing boats. Thor's hammer at work, obviously. Religious observances weren't just a matter of personal faith, but community obligation. When a sacrifice was called for, participation wasn't optional. The famous blot ceremonies involved the ritual slaughter of animals and possibly, though more rarely, humans, with the blood collected and sprinkled on statues of the gods, temple walls, and even the participants. The meat would then be consumed in a communal meal that bound the community together through shared religious experience and protein. The concept of luck wasn't the random chance we consider today, but a quasi-magical property that some people and families possessed in greater quantities than others. A lucky leader was followed loyally because their luck might extend to their followers. An unlucky person might be avoided or even exiled, their misfortune considered contagious. Omens and portents were taken extremely seriously. A raven landing on your roof might be Odin sending a message. A deformed animal birth could portend disaster for the entire community. Dreams weren't your brain processing the day's events, but direct communications from gods or deceased ancestors. The psychological burden of constantly interpreting everyday occurrences for supernatural significance must have been exhausting. Entertainment ranges from thrilling sagas and stories to slightly disturbing, often violent games and events. Gladiator-like contests are less about fun and more about surviving to see another uncomfortable sunrise. The concept of fun in the Viking Age had a decidedly different flavor than our modern idea of entertainment. Take the popular sport of Nataliker, a ball game that was something like a cross between hockey, rugby, and legalized assault. The rules were minimal. The playing field was whatever reasonably flat area was available, and injuries were not just common, but expected. Broken bones, concussions, and occasionally deaths were all part of the game. Arguments over the outcome frequently led to blood feuds lasting generations. Your friendly neighborhood soccer league, this was not. Wrestling matches, called glima, were less lethal, but no less intense. Technique mattered, but size and strength advantages were significant. And with no weight classes, smaller competitors often found themselves thoroughly outmatched. These weren't organized sporting events with referees and rule books. They were tests of strength and skill that could determine your social standing in the community. For less physically inclined Vikings, board games provided mental challenges. Hanefa Tafel, often called Viking chess, though it predates chess in Northern Europe, was a strategic game where one player with a king piece and defenders tried to help the king escape, while the other player's pieces attempted to capture him. The game taught strategic thinking and was often used to settle minor disputes without resorting to physical violence. Less bloodshed is always a good thing when medical care consists mainly of hoping wounds heal on their own. Music and poetry were highly valued, with skalds, poet-musicians, enjoying high status in courts and halls. Their compositions weren't just entertainment, but served as historical records, propaganda tools, and vehicles for preserving cultural values and norms. A skilled skald could make or break a leader's reputation with cleverly crafted verses that might be repeated across the Norse world. Feasts and festivals punctuated the agricultural year, providing rare moments of abundance in a life otherwise defined by scarcity and hard work. Yule, the midwinter celebration, brought communities together for days of eating, drinking, and reaffirming social bonds. The spring festival of Sigerblot marked the start of the raiding season, while harvest festivals gave thanks to the gods for whatever food would sustain the community through the coming winter. Alcohol played a central role in most social gatherings, with mead, ale, and occasionally imported wine flowing freely. Drinking wasn't just recreational, but ritualistic, with formal toasts to gods and ancestors expected before general consumption could begin. Drinking horns would be passed around communal gatherings, making the sharing of germs as important as the sharing of alcohol. And then there were the funerals, particularly those of chieftains or other important figures. These weren't somber, quiet affairs, but elaborate ceremonies that could last days and involve substantial resources. The famous ship burials, where a leader would be placed in a ship along with grave goods, and sometimes sacrificed slaves or animals before being either buried or set aflame, were spectacular events that combined religious ceremony with displays of wealth and power. The most macabre entertainment, however, involved the execution of criminals or enemies. Public executions weren't just about justice but spectacle. The infamous blood eagle, described in Norse sagas as a method of execution where the victim's ribs were severed from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, while the lungs were pulled through the wounds, may or may not have been actually practiced. Scholars debate its historicity, but the fact that it was described in detail in multiple sagas speaks to the Viking appetite for graphic violence as both punishment and warning. Human sacrifice, while not an everyday occurrence, did happen during particularly important religious ceremonies or times of great crisis. Archaeological evidence from sites like the temple at Uppsala in Sweden suggests ritual killings, followed by the display of bodies in sacred groves. Whether the victims went willingly, believing in the religious significance of their deaths, or were unwilling sacrifices is largely unknown, though sagas suggest both scenarios occurred. These darker aspects of Viking entertainment and social life remind us that the past truly is a foreign country where they did things differently. What we would consider horrifying violations of human rights were, to them, normal aspects of justice, religion, and even entertainment. The Viking worldview accepted harshness and violence as inevitable parts of existence in a way our modern sensibilities find difficult to comprehend. Historical interlude. Key events. Relax as I briefly guide you through pivotal moments, peacefully, sleepily, deeply historical. The raid on Lindisfarne, 793 AD, opening Europe's eyes to Viking prowess. This wasn't just any monastery. It was one of the most sacred sites in Anglo-Saxon England, a center of learning and religious devotion. The Viking attack wasn't just about plunder, but represented a shocking violation of what medieval Christians considered inviolable sacred space. Monks were slaughtered or drowned. Treasures accumulated over generations were stolen, and manuscripts representing years of painstaking work were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The psychological impact of the Lindisfarne raid rippled across Europe. Suddenly, nowhere seemed safe, not even the holiest places dedicated to God. The Vikings gained an immediate reputation for exceptional brutality, though in reality, they were no more violent than other medieval warriors. They just had the misfortune, or tactical brilliance, to attack targets that were both wealthy and populated by people who could write, ensuring their reputation for savagery would be recorded for posterity. Chronicles from the time describe the raiders as sent by God to punish Christians for their sins, a common theological interpretation of disaster in the medieval period. The monk Alcuin of York wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." This raid marked the beginning of the Viking Age in Western European consciousness, though Norse expansion had already begun in less documented regions. The discovery of Iceland and Greenland, harsh lands perfect for rugged survivalists. Iceland wasn't exactly uninhabited when the Norse arrived around 874 CE. Irish monks had established small settlements, but fled when the more numerous and decidedly less monastic Vikings appeared. What the Norse found was a volcanic island with limited arable land, no native trees suitable for shipbuilding, and weather that could generously be described as challenging. Yet they stayed and established farms and communities that survive to this day. The settlement of Iceland wasn't primarily about raiding or conquest, but about finding land to farm in a Scandinavia that was running out of available territory. Many of the settlers were actually fleeing the increasing centralization of power in Norway under King Harald Fairhair, preferring hardship with independence to comfort under growing royal authority. Life in Iceland was brutal by any standard. The short growing season and poor soil meant frequent food shortages. Volcanic eruptions periodically devastated what little farmland existed. Isolation meant that once the initial settlement period ended, new tools, technologies, and goods were scarce. The settlers adapted by developing a unique form of democracy called the Althing, possibly the world's oldest parliamentary body, which met annually to settle disputes and establish laws. Greenland, discovered by Eric the Red around 985 CE, represented an even more ambitious attempt at colonization. Eric, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, a common reason for relocation in the Viking Age, stumbled upon the massive island and, with marketing skills well ahead of his time, named it Greenland to attract settlers despite its largely ice-covered terrain. The name was perhaps the first real estate scam in the New World. Two main settlements were established on Greenland's southwestern coast, eventually housing around 3,000 people at their peak. Archaeological evidence shows they raised livestock, hunted seal and caribou, and traded walrus ivory with Europe. They even built churches and had their own bishop, maintaining cultural and religious connections with their homeland. Yet the Greenland colonies ultimately failed, with the last known contact occurring in the early 15th century. Climate change, the Little Ice Age, economic isolation as European trade patterns shifted, conflicts with the indigenous Inuit population, and simple bad luck all contributed to their extinction. When Europeans returned to Greenland centuries later, they found ruins but no survivors of the once thriving Norse colonies. The legendary travels of Leif Erikson, reaching North America centuries before Columbus, the son of Eric the Red, Leif further extended Norse exploration by reaching the shores of North America around 1000 CE, nearly 500 years before Columbus made his more famous voyage. The Norse called this new land Vinland, possibly referring to wild grapes or berries they found growing there. Archaeological evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, confirms the Norse presence in North America, with the remains of 8 buildings, including a forge and evidence of ironworking. This wasn't just a brief landing, but an attempt at a more permanent presence, though it lasted only a few years at most. Why didn't the Norse colonization of North America succeed? Several factors contributed to its failure. The small number of settlers couldn't establish a self-sustaining colony, especially given the hostile relationships that quickly developed with the indigenous peoples, whom the Norse called Skraelings. The sagas describe several violent encounters that made the Norse position precarious at best. Additionally, the distance from Greenland and Iceland made regular supply and communication difficult, and the potential benefits didn't seem to justify the risks and resources required for permanent settlement. Unlike later European colonizers, the Vikings lacked the population pressure, technology, immunity to old world diseases, and political organization that would make subsequent colonization efforts more successful, albeit devastating for indigenous populations. Had the Norse colonization of North America succeeded, world history might have taken a dramatically different course. As it was, the knowledge of these Western lands faded into legend, preserved in the Icelandic sagas, but not influencing European exploration until centuries later. Harold Bluetooth uniting Denmark, shaping the future of Northern Europe. Harold Bluetooth Gormson, King of Denmark, from approximately 958 to 986 CE, achieved something remarkable in the Viking world: political unification of a significant territory. Before Harold, Denmark consisted of numerous competing chieftains and petty kings. Through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages, and political maneuvering, Harold created something resembling a unified Danish state. His nickname, Bluetooth, may have come from a conspicuous dead tooth that appeared blue-black, or possibly from his fondness for blueberries that stained his teeth. Either way, the name stuck and has achieved immortality not just in history books, but in modern technology. The Bluetooth wireless standard is named after him, with the Bluetooth symbol combining the runic initials of his name. Harold's most controversial and far-reaching decision was his conversion to Christianity around 965 CE. The gelling stones, massive runic monuments he erected, proudly proclaim this achievement, with one stone declaring that Harold made the Danes Christian. This wasn't just a personal religious choice, but a political calculation. Christian kingdoms to the south were becoming increasingly powerful, and alignment with them offered trade and alliance opportunities. The conversion wasn't immediate or complete. Archaeological evidence shows pagan and Christian practices coexisting for generations, but it set Denmark firmly on a path toward integration with mainstream European culture and politics. Harold's son, Sweyn Forkbeard, would continue this political consolidation, eventually conquering England in 1013, briefly uniting the two kingdoms and setting the stage for Nut the Great's North Sea Empire. Harold's efforts at unification were not universally welcomed. Many local chieftains and jarls, nobles, resisted the centralization of power, preferring their traditional independence. Harold's construction of massive ring fortresses across Denmark, perfect circles with precisely laid out internal streets and buildings, demonstrated both his power and his determination to maintain control. These fortresses, known as Trelleborg-type fortresses, represented significant engineering achievements and served as administrative centers, military garrisons, and visible symbols of royal authority. The fortresses also tell us something important about Viking Age society. Despite the popular image of Vikings as anarchic raiders, they were capable of sophisticated political organization when circumstances required it. The transformation from a collection of independent chieftains to a unified kingdom didn't happen overnight. But Harold Bluetooth laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the modern Nordic states. And finally, the gradual Christianization of Vikings, transforming a fierce culture forever. This wasn't a single event, but a process spanning generations, with significant regional variations in timing and intensity. While Denmark began officially converting in the mid-10th century under Harold Bluetooth, Sweden remained predominantly pagan until the 12th century, with the temple at Uppsala continuing to function as a pagan cult center long after Christianity had been nominally accepted by Swedish royalty. The conversion process wasn't simply a matter of replacing one set of beliefs with another. Instead, it involved a complex syncretism where Christian practices and beliefs were interpreted through a Norse cultural lens. Christ was sometimes portrayed as a warrior god. Not unlike Thor or Odin, saints took on aspects of Norse deities, with Saint Olaf inheriting attributes of Thor and Saint Brigid sharing characteristics with the goddess Brigid. The material culture of the period reflects this religious transition. Pendants featuring Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, were worn alongside and eventually replaced by Christian crosses, burial practices gradually shifted from cremation or ship burial with grave goods to Christian inhumation without worldly possessions. Churches were sometimes built on or near former pagan holy sites, both to claim the sacred space and to ease the transition for local populations. Christianity brought literacy to the Norse world, with the first written records in the native Scandinavian languages appearing in a Christian context. The same runic alphabet previously used for brief memorial inscriptions or magical formulas was adapted to record longer texts, including early law codes and, eventually, the sagas that preserve so much of what we know about Viking culture. The conversion also connected Scandinavia more firmly to broader European political and cultural currents. Norse kings could now participate in international diplomacy on an equal footing with other Christian monarchs. Trade networks expanded as religious differences no longer created barriers to commercial interaction. The traditional Viking raids on Christian territories became less acceptable as Scandinavians themselves adopted the faith they had once plundered. For ordinary Norse people, Christianity brought both benefits and costs. The new religion prohibited certain traditional practices, including polygamy and the exposure of unwanted infants, which had been common methods for managing family size and resources. Blood feuds, a traditional method of maintaining social order through the threat of revenge, were gradually replaced by more centralized legal systems backed by royal power and Christian ethics. At the same time, Christianity introduced new social safety mechanisms, including the concept of charity as a religious duty. Monasteries often served as providers of medical care, education, and aid to the poor, services that had previously been the sole responsibility of family networks. The establishment of parish churches created new community focal points and opportunities for social interaction beyond kin groups. By the end of the Viking Age, in the mid-11th century, Scandinavia was nominally Christian, though pagan beliefs and practices persisted in remote areas and as folk traditions that sometimes continue to the present day. The conversion represents one of the most profound cultural transformations in European history, turning feared raiders into participants in the mainstream of medieval civilization. Chapter 4: Harsh Realities of the Natural World. When we imagine life in the Viking Age, we often forget just how utterly vulnerable humans were to the whims of nature. Modern infrastructure, heating, plumbing, grocery stores, weather forecasting has created a buffer between us and the natural world that Vikings could scarcely imagine. For them, nature wasn't something to be enjoyed on weekend hikes. It was an omnipresent force that could sustain or destroy with equal indifference. Winter in Scandinavia isn't just cold, it's an existential challenge. Temperatures regularly plunge far below freezing. Daylight shrinks to a few precious hours, and snow can render travel impossible for months at a time. The Norse calendar recognized just 2 seasons, summer and winter, with winter occupying the lion's share of the year. Preparing for winter was a community's primary occupation during the more hospitable months. Hay had to be cut and dried to feed livestock through the cold months. Fish and meat needed smoking or drying. Fruits and vegetables were preserved through fermentation or drying. Firewood, enormous quantities of it, had to be gathered and stored. One miscalculation, one unexpected early frost, and an entire community might starve before spring. Homes required constant maintenance to withstand winter conditions. Roofs needed rethatching, walls needed reinforcement, and any gap that allowed the bitter wind to penetrate could mean the difference between uncomfortable survival and deadly exposure. The architecture of Viking Age homes reflected this reality, with thick walls, few windows, and often a central hearth that served as both cooking area and the primary source of heat. When winter finally descended, life contracted dramatically. Extended families would gather around the central hearth, sharing body heat and conserving precious fuel. Activities shifted to indoor crafts, weaving, carving, tool making, and repair work that couldn't be done during the busy summer months. Storytelling reached its peak during these dark days, with the sagas and myths serving not just as entertainment, but as cultural education and reinforcement of social values. The psychological impact of the northern winter shouldn't be underestimated. Seasonal affective disorder, SAID, wasn't recognized, but the winter depression was a reality. The sagas occasionally reference individuals who became withdrawn, morose, or even violent during the winter months, a phenomenon modern psychiatry would recognize as consistent with severe seasonal mood disorders. Spring brought its own challenges. As the snow melted, roads and paths turned to mud, making travel difficult precisely when people were most eager to move about after winter confinement. Rivers swelled with meltwater, washing away bridges and drowning the unwary. Fields needed immediate attention to take advantage of the short growing season, but working waterlogged soil was backbreaking labor that often yielded poor results. Summer, the all too brief respite from winter's grip, brought different natural challenges. Insect infestations could destroy crops or spread disease among livestock and humans alike. Drought could wither fields just as surely as early frost. Summer storms could flatten crops ready for harvest, representing not just the loss of immediate food, but the seeds needed for next year's planting. For coastal communities, the sea provided resources, but also constant danger. Fishing was essential for survival, but claimed lives regularly. Storms could arise with little warning, and without modern weather forecasting, fishermen and traders often found themselves at the mercy of waves, capable of swallowing ships whole. The sagas are filled with matter-of-fact accounts of entire crews lost at sea, a common enough occurrence that it warranted little special comment. Inland, forests harbored their own dangers. Wolves, bears, and boar posed genuine threats to humans, especially those traveling alone. Getting lost in dense woodland could be a death sentence, particularly as winter approached. Yet these same forests provided essential resources: game, timber, honey, medicinal plants that made braving their dangers necessary. Natural disasters struck with a frequency and intensity that modern infrastructure has largely insulated us from experiencing. Volcanic eruptions in Iceland repeatedly caused crop failures through ashfall and climate cooling. The Laki eruption of 1783, after the Viking Age, but illustrative of vulnerabilities that existed earlier, killed 20% of Iceland's population through direct effects and the resulting famine. Similar events during the Viking Age would have been interpreted as the wrath of gods rather than understood through geology, adding psychological terror to physical suffering. Disease, without germ theory to explain it or antibiotics to treat it, appeared as mysteriously as any supernatural curse. Epidemics swept through communities with nothing to stop them beyond isolation. Effective, but rarely practiced systematically, and folk remedies of variable usefulness. A minor infection could progress to life-threatening sepsis with no intervention available beyond poultices, prayers, and hope. Famine stalked the Norse world with terrible regularity. The marginal agricultural land of much of Scandinavia provided little buffer against crop failures. One bad summer could mean depleted stores by midwinter, with the grim choices that entailed: who would eat and who wouldn't. Historical and archaeological evidence indicates that in times of severe famine, the old and very young suffered first, with communities making the brutal calculation that those most likely to survive and contribute should receive the limited resources available. The Norse response to these natural challenges was a pragmatic fatalism embodied in their religious outlook. The concept of weird or fate, the idea that certain events were predetermined and unavoidable, helped make sense of a world where human control over circumstances was minimal. When half your children died before reaching adulthood, when crops failed despite your best efforts, when sudden illness struck down the strongest among you, belief in an ordered, if harsh, universe offered some comfort. This fatalism didn't mean passivity. The Norse worked tenaciously to survive in their challenging environment, developing technologies and social structures specifically adapted to northern conditions. Their ships represent the pinnacle of this adaptation, flexible enough to withstand heavy seas, shallow drafted enough to navigate rivers, light enough to be portaged between waterways when necessary. These vessels transformed a geographical disadvantage, living at the cold, northern edge of Europe, into a strategic advantage by providing mobility and access that more centrally located peoples lacked. Similarly, Norse social organization evolved to address environmental challenges. The communal work party, where neighbors gathered to help with labor-intensive tasks like barn raising or harvest, ensured that essential work was completed efficiently. The Thing, an assembly where free men could participate in legal and political decisions, provided a mechanism for resolving disputes without resource-draining feuds, and for organizing communal responses to natural disasters. Yet, despite these adaptations, the margin between survival and catastrophe remained razor thin throughout the Viking Age. Modern visitors to Scandinavia, enjoying its pristine natural beauty from the comfort of well-insulated hotels or touring its history in climate-controlled museums, can easily forget that this stunning landscape once demanded daily heroism from those who called it home. So, as you drift towards sleep in your temperature-controlled bedroom, having eaten food you didn't grow and wearing clothes you didn't weave, consider how recently in human history such comforts would have seemed as fantastical as the most extravagant tales of Valhalla. The gap between our lives and those of our Viking ancestors is measured not just in years, but in an almost incomprehensible difference in basic security and comfort. The nuclear family, as we understand it today, mom, dad, 2.5 children, and perhaps a dog named Spot, bears little resemblance to the Viking Age household. Instead, imagine an extended family unit spanning multiple generations, often including not just blood relatives, but also servants, thralls, slaves, and occasionally foster children from other families. This wasn't just a social arrangement, but an economic necessity. Survival required many hands working together. Children in the Viking Age experienced a childhood dramatically different from modern Western norms. Infancy was precarious, with estimates suggesting that 50% or more of children died before reaching age 5. This grim reality shaped parenting practices and emotional attachments. While Norse parents certainly loved their children, they faced the brutal necessity of maintaining some emotional distance from infants who might not survive long enough to be named. Speaking of names, the Norse naming system reflected both family connections and superstitious hopes for a child's future. Children were commonly named after recently deceased relatives, believed to carry on some essence of the departed. Names often incorporated elements suggesting strength, wisdom, or divine favor. Thor, thunder; As, God; Ulf, wolf; Bjorn, bear; Hild, battle; and Sig, victory, appear frequently in compound names. Childhood ended early by our standards. By age 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute meaningfully to household labor, watching younger siblings, gathering eggs, scaring birds from fields, collecting firewood. By 12, boys were considered capable of bearing arms, and girls ready to manage household tasks independently. Legal adulthood generally arrived around 15 or 16, though full social adulthood came with marriage and establishing a separate household. Education happened through apprenticeship and observation, not formal schooling. Children learned by watching and helping adults, gradually taking on more complex tasks as they demonstrated competence. Literacy was rare and generally limited to runic inscriptions used for memorials, ownership marks, and occasional messages. The complex literary culture preserved in later sagas existed primarily as oral tradition during most of the Viking Age, with stories memorized and recited rather than read. Marriage in the Viking Age was primarily an economic and political arrangement rather than a romantic one. Marriages were negotiated between families, with detailed contracts specifying bride price, payment to the bride's family, dowry, assets the bride brought to the marriage, and inheritance rights. Love was considered a pleasant bonus if it developed, but not a prerequisite for a successful match. That said, women in Viking society had rights that would have shocked their contemporaries in much of Europe. Norse women could own property independently, initiate divorce under certain circumstances, and run businesses or farms in their husband's absence. The sagas feature formidable female characters who wielded considerable influence through both direct action and behind-the-scenes manipulation. Still, gender roles were clearly defined. Men's sphere encompassed warfare, long-distance trade, shipbuilding, metalworking, and heavy agricultural labor. Women controlled the inner realm, food preparation, textile production, dairy processing, child rearing, and household management. Both roles were essential for survival, creating a practical interdependence that gave women more leverage than in societies where their contributions were less visibly vital. Divorce was relatively straightforward. By medieval standards, either party could initiate it for reasons including abuse, abandonment, or failure to fulfill marital duties. Property division followed the original marriage contract, with women typically retaining their dowries and any inheritance received during the marriage. Children usually remained with the father after divorce, as they belonged to his family line, though exceptions existed. Beyond the family unit, Viking society was organized into a hierarchical structure with significant regional variations. At the top stood kings and jarls, earls or nobles, followed by wealthy landowners, free farmers of varying prosperity, cottagers with small land holdings, freedmen, former slaves, and at the bottom, thralls or slaves who had no legal personhood. Social mobility existed but was limited. A particularly successful farmer might rise to local prominence. A thrall might earn or be granted freedom. A warrior might gain wealth and status through service to a powerful lord. However, the circumstances of one's birth largely determined one's opportunities and constraints. Legal matters were decided at things, assemblies where free men gathered to resolve disputes, establish laws, and handle community governance. The most famous of these was Iceland's Althing, established around 930 CE, and considered the world's oldest parliamentary institution. The Thing system represented a form of direct democracy, albeit one limited to free male property owners. Justice in the Viking Age relied heavily on concepts of honor and compensation rather than imprisonment or rehabilitation. Murderers typically paid weregild, literally man money, to the victim's family rather than facing execution or confinement. The amount varied based on the victim's social status. Killing a jarl cost substantially more than killing a farmer, and killing a thrall merely required compensating the owner for lost property. When compensation failed to satisfy, blood feuds emerged, cycles of retaliatory killings that could continue for generations. These feuds weren't lawless vendettas, but followed specific cultural rules about appropriate targets and timing. The sagas describe elaborate codes governing which family members could legitimately be killed in revenge and which were off limits. Community cohesion was maintained through various social customs beyond the legal system. Hospitality requirements obligated even modest households to offer food and shelter to travelers, creating reciprocal obligations that functioned as a primitive social safety net. Feasting had political dimensions, with attendance and seating arrangements carefully calibrated to reflect and reinforce social hierarchies. Gift giving served as both social lubricant and subtle power play. Gifts created obligation, with the recipient expected to reciprocate with something of equal or greater value at an appropriate time. Kings and chieftains maintained loyalty through generous gift giving, while failure to give appropriate gifts could trigger serious social conflict. The Old Norse term neid, roughly translated as mockery, but carrying stronger connotations of shame, describes the social death that could result from failing to uphold gift and hospitality obligations. This complex social system evolved specifically to address the challenges of life in Northern Europe, balancing individual autonomy against community needs in an environment where cooperation was essential for survival. Modern individualism would have been not just alien, but suicidal in the Viking context, where isolation meant certain death in the harsh northern winters. As you find yourself drifting deeper toward sleep, consider how your own social connections, family, friends, community, differ from those of your Viking ancestors. Your relationships may be based more on affinity than necessity. Your legal protections more universal, your social mobility greater, yet the fundamental human need for connection and belonging remains unchanged across the centuries, a thread linking you to those long ago people whose lives were simultaneously so different from and so similar to your own. Earlier, I touched briefly on Viking hygiene practices, but the reality deserves a more thorough exploration, particularly because it runs counter to many popular misconceptions. The Vikings have developed a curious, posthumous reputation for being unusually clean by medieval standards, which contains elements of both truth and exaggeration. Archaeological evidence suggests that grooming tools were common personal possessions. Combs made from antler or bone appear frequently in grave goods and settlement excavations. These weren't crude implements, but often finely crafted items with intricate decorative carving, suggesting they were valued possessions. Similarly, tweezers, ear scoops, and nail cleaners have been found, indicating attention to personal grooming. The Norse word laugardagr, Saturday, literally translates as washing day, suggesting a weekly bathing routine. Luxurious by early medieval European standards, where some monastic rules recommended bathing only a few times per year. However, this bathing needs contextualizing. In winter, it might involve no more than a quick scrub with a cloth dipped in a basin of heated water. In summer, it could mean a dip in a lake or stream, likely without soap, which was an expensive luxury produced from ash and animal fat. Public bathing facilities, similar to Roman baths but less elaborate, existed in some larger settlements. These were heated rooms where people would sweat, scrape their skin with scrapers, rather like primitive loofahs, and then rinse with water. These proto-saunas, called bathhouses in the sagas, served social as well as hygienic functions, being places where news was exchanged and community bonds reinforced. Contemporary accounts from outsiders sometimes remark on Norse cleanliness, but these observations need careful interpretation. When Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan encountered the Rus, Swedish Vikings, on the Volga River in 922 CE, he described their daily washing routine, but found it disgusting because they shared the same basin of water without changing it, simply rinsing their mouths and blowing their noses into it between uses. What struck Fadlan as repellent was still more washing than many Europeans practiced. English chroniclers complained that Viking men were too attractive to English women because they bathed weekly, combed their hair, and changed their clothes regularly. The monk John of Wallingford wrote that the Danes were able to seduce married women because they combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and even changed their clothes frequently. This suggests that by comparison, Anglo-Saxon men were less attentive to personal hygiene, making Vikings seem relatively clean, despite practices we would consider rudimentary. The reality of Viking hygiene falls somewhere between the extremes of filthy barbarian and fastidious neat freak. They maintained a level of cleanliness practical for their lifestyle and technology, neither obsessive nor entirely negligent. Their reputation for cleanliness comes mainly from contrast with contemporaries who bathed even less frequently. Dental hygiene, as mentioned earlier, centered around chewing sticks, typically twigs with frayed ends used to clean between teeth. Archaeological evidence shows mixed dental health among Viking age remains. Some skulls show severe tooth wear and decay, while others display surprisingly good preservation. Diet played a significant role here, with less sugar consumption than modern diets, but more abrasive particles from stone-ground flour wearing down enamel over time. Clothing maintenance presented another hygiene challenge. Wool, the primary textile, absorbed odors readily and was difficult to clean thoroughly. Washing clothes often meant simply beating them with sticks and airing them out, rather than immersing them in water, which could damage wool fibers and cause shrinkage. Linen undergarments, when available, could be more thoroughly washed and provided some barrier between skin and outer woolens. Parasites were unavoidable companions in Viking life. Analysis of soil from Viking settlements reveals abundant evidence of intestinal worms, including roundworm and whipworm. External parasites, like lice and fleas, were similarly ubiquitous, with fine-toothed, delousing combs among the most common archaeological finds. These weren't signs of unusual filthiness, but the normal condition of pre-modern populations. Without access to modern parasiticides, odor perception differed significantly from modern sensibilities. In a world where everyone carried similar bacterial profiles and similar diets produced similar body odors, the baseline for what constituted offensive smell was much higher than ours. Smoke from constant indoor fires permeated everything, creating a universal background scent that would be overpowering to modern noses, but was simply the normal backdrop of existence for Vikings. As you sink deeper into your clean, fresh-smelling bedding, consider how your standards of cleanliness would appear to your Viking ancestors, perhaps as strangely excessive as theirs might seem insufficient to you. The difference lies not in an inherent preference for filth or cleanliness, but in the technological means available to achieve hygiene and the cultural norms defining acceptable levels of bodily maintenance. Chapter 7: The Myth of the Viking Warrior. No aspect of Viking culture has been more romanticized than the warrior tradition. Popular imagination conjures berserkers in bearskin cloaks, charging fearlessly into battle. Mighty heroes wielding legendary weapons, and fearless sea raiders striking terror into coastal communities across Europe. The reality, as always, was considerably more complex and often less glamorous. First, let's address a fundamental misconception. Not all Vikings were warriors. The term Viking originally referred specifically to the activity of raiding, not to an ethnic or cultural identity. Most Norse people were farmers, craftspeople, traders, and fishers who never participated in raids or battles. The popular image of an entire society organized around warfare misrepresents a culture where agricultural production, not combat, occupied most people's time and energy. For those who did participate in raiding and warfare, the experience wasn't the glorious adventure often portrayed in modern media. Viking combat was brutal, chaotic, and terrifying. The typical Viking warrior wasn't a heavily armored professional, but a farmer with minimal protection beyond perhaps a helmet, a wooden shield, and padded clothing. Chainmail existed, but was expensive and relatively rare, reserved for wealthy warriors and leaders. Weapons were similarly stratified by wealth. The iconic Viking sword, pattern-welded steel with decorated hilt and pommel, represented a significant investment equivalent to the price of several cows. Most ordinary warriors would have carried spears, axes, knives, or bows, weapons that doubled as tools and required less specialized materials to produce. The association of every Viking with a magnificent sword is as inaccurate as assuming every modern person drives a luxury car. The berserkers, those legendary warriors, said to fight in an uncontrollable, trance-like fury, remain a subject of historical debate. They appear in the sagas as elite warriors dedicated to Odin who fought with supernatural strength and fearlessness, sometimes wearing bear or wolf skins. The term berserker likely derives from bear shirt or bear shirt, depending on which etymology you accept. Some scholars suggest these warriors may have used mind-altering substances, perhaps fly agaric mushrooms, bog myrtle, or alcohol, to induce their battle frenzy. Others argue the berserker rage was a cultivated psychological state, achieved through ritual and self-hypnosis. A third perspective holds that berserkers were primarily literary creations, exaggerated or entirely fictional characters meant to embody the terrifying aspects of Norse warfare rather than historical figures. Whatever their nature, berserkers represented the extreme edge of Viking warrior culture, not its typical expression. The average Norse combatant wasn't an unstoppable war machine, but a pragmatic fighter who preferred advantage to fair fights and survival to glorious death. This pragmatism extended to battle tactics. Vikings gained their fearsome reputation not through superior individual combat skills, but through strategic innovation and psychological warfare. Their ships allowed them to strike where least expected, bypassing conventional defenses. They preferred surprise attacks on vulnerable targets to pitched battles against prepared opponents. When faced with superior forces, they had no cultural compunction against strategic retreat. Living to fight another day was considered more sensible than dying unnecessarily. The myth of Vikings, never fearing death because they believed fallen warriors went to Valhalla, significantly distorts Norse religious attitudes. While Valhalla existed in their cosmology as a hall where some slain warriors feasted with Odin, it wasn't the only or even the primary afterlife destination. Most dead were believed to go to Hell's realm, not equivalent to the Christian hell, but simply the underworld, or to various other destinations, depending on their manner of death. Drowning victims, for instance, were thought to be welcomed by the goddess Ran. Moreover, the sagas make clear that Norse people feared death as much as any other humans. They took protective measures, sought healing for wounds, and generally tried to avoid dying when possible. The concept of dying well, facing death bravely when it became inevitable, was valued, but this is fundamentally different from not fearing death at all. The image of Vikings as exceptionally bloodthirsty also requires qualification. They were certainly capable of extreme violence, as the raid on Lindisfarne and similar attacks demonstrate. However, their methods weren't notably more brutal than those of their contemporaries. The Frankish king Charlemagne, for instance, ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day at Verdun in 782 CE, an atrocity that exceeds any single Viking massacre in recorded history. What distinguished Viking violence was not its intensity, but its targets. By attacking religious institutions like monasteries, which other Christian powers generally respected as off-limits, they violated contemporary norms of warfare in a way that shocked chroniclers and guaranteed their reputation for exceptional brutality. In reality, they were product of their time, no more inherently violent than their contemporaries, but operating outside the established rules that governed violence between Christian powers. Viking military equipment reflected practical concerns rather than heroic aesthetics. The famous horned helmet never existed in reality. As mentioned earlier, actual Viking helmets were typically simple conical or rounded designs with a nose guard extension. Many warriors likely fought without helmets at all, as these were expensive items that might be passed down through generations. The iconic round shield with central boss was indeed common, but its use involved more skill and strategy than the simple barrier function often portrayed. Viking shields were relatively thin, around a centimeter thick, and not particularly large, designed more for deflecting blows than absorbing them directly. Warriors were taught to angle shields, to redirect force, and to use the metal boss as an offensive weapon in close quarters. Body armor, when available, typically consisted of layers of quilted cloth, leather, or in wealthier cases, mail. The full plate armor depicted in many modern Viking portrayals wouldn't be developed for centuries. Protection was balanced against mobility, with most warriors preferring the ability to move quickly over heavier defensive equipment. Training for combat wasn't formalized as in later medieval knights' education. Young men learned weapon skills from older relatives and through games that developed relevant abilities. Wrestling, for instance, was both popular entertainment and practical combat training, teaching balance, leverage, and close quarters grappling that could be life-saving in battle. For most Norse people who occasionally participated in raids or defensive actions, fighting was a secondary skill developed alongside their primary occupations. Only chieftains and kings could afford to maintain dedicated warriors. The housecarls or herdmen who served as both bodyguards and military corps, around which larger forces of farmer soldiers could be organized when needed. As you drift deeper toward sleep, let the mythic Viking warrior transform in your mind's eye from an invincible, fearless berserker to a more human figure, a farmer who sometimes fought, a raider who preferred surprise to fair combat, a person who, like all humans throughout history, feared death and pain, but faced them when necessary. This more nuanced understanding doesn't diminish the real accomplishments of Norse warriors, but places them in human context, neither demonizing them as mindless savages nor idealizing them as perfect heroes. Still awake, I see my previous narration about Viking discomfort hasn't quite lulled you into blissful unconsciousness yet. Very well, let's continue our somnolent journey through the fjords of historical reality with 5 lesser-known facts about our Norse friends that your history teacher probably glossed over, either because they didn't know, or more likely, because they wanted to spare you the grim, unhygienic details. So, adjust your pillow one more time, perhaps count a few non-Viking sheep, and let me guide you through some historical tidbits that will make you even more grateful for your modern existence, where the biggest threat to your well-being is probably that midnight snack you're contemplating after I finish talking. Fact 1. Vikings used urine as laundry detergent. As you lie there in your fresh sheets, perhaps scented with lavender or mountain breeze or whatever fabric softener promises to transport you to an aromatic paradise. Consider the Viking approach to laundry day. No, not a washing machine with a delicate cycle, not color-safe bleach. Instead, a bucket of stale human urine. I'm not making this up for a dramatic effect. The Norse actually collected urine in dedicated containers, let it sit until it became particularly pungent, giving the ammonia content time to develop, and then used this eye-watering solution to clean their woolens. They called this substance lye, though it's different from the lye we know today, and it was literally a pot of aged urine. The science behind this is surprisingly sound. Urine contains ammonia, which is still a component in some modern cleaning products. The ammonia in fermented urine would break down dirt and grime, and even helped set dyes in textiles. The Vikings would soak their clothes in this aromatic concoction, stomp on them like winemakers crushing grapes, because agitation helps with cleaning, as your modern washing machine knows, and then rinse them in the nearest stream. The results? Surprisingly effective cleaning, with one significant drawback: everything smelled faintly of urine. This wasn't considered a problem because, well, everything and everyone already smelled like a complex bouquet of organic aromas that would send a modern person racing for the nearest bottle of air freshener. So the next time you casually toss your clothes into a machine that does all the work while you watch Netflix, remember your Norse ancestors stomping barefoot on urine-soaked tunics, their eyes watering from the ammonia fumes, probably wondering if there might be an easier way to remove sheep dung from wool. There wasn't, at least not for another 1,000 years or so. And if you're wondering who collected all this urine, it was a family affair. Everyone contributed to the communal peapot. Nothing brings a family closer together than a shared bucket of excretions saved for laundry day. Modern family game night suddenly doesn't seem so bad, does it? Fact 2. Viking sunstones were nature's GPS long before GPS satellites, smartphone maps, or even reliable compasses. Vikings navigated across vast oceanic expanses with remarkable accuracy. Their secret, a crystal called sunstone, Iceland spar, which sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but was actually a sophisticated polarized light filter. On cloudy days when the sun wasn't visible, a common occurrence in northern latitudes, navigators would hold up these calcite crystals and rotate them until polarized light patterns revealed the exact position of the hidden sun. This allowed them to determine direction with astonishing precision, even when the sky was completely overcast. For context, this is roughly equivalent to you being dropped in the middle of the ocean with no technology, looking at a rock in your hand, and accurately saying, "Ah, yes, New York is that way, about 2,500 miles." The Viking navigational method was so effective that some researchers believe it would have worked in twilight, and even in the brief, dark period of Arctic summer nights. Archaeological evidence supports this seemingly magical method. In 2013, a sunstone was discovered amid the wreckage of an Elizabethan ship that sank in 1592, suggesting the technology remained useful long after the Viking Age ended. Some experts believe this technology might explain how Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus stumbled onto Caribbean shores while looking for India. Talk about needing better navigation. The true marvel here isn't just that the method worked, but that someone discovered it in the first place. Imagine the first Viking who picked up an unusual crystal, looked through it at the sky, noticed subtle changes while rotating it, and instead of tossing it aside as a pretty curiosity, thought, I bet I could use this to navigate thousands of miles of open ocean where a mistake means certain death. That's the kind of innovative thinking, born of necessity and close observation of the natural world, that modern convenience has largely engineered out of our daily lives. While you rely on satellites orbiting the Earth at 17,000 miles per hour to find the nearest Starbucks, visualize a Viking holding a crystal to the sky, calculating precise directional headings using polarized light patterns invisible to the naked eye, and then setting course across the unforgiving North Atlantic. And they did this without caffeine. Now that's impressive. Fact 3. Viking legal proceedings featured rap battles of insults. The Vikings had a fascinating aspect to their legal system called flighting, formalized, metrically structured insult contests that functioned somewhat like judicial rap battles. These weren't just amusing sideshows, but could be serious legal proceedings with real consequences. Imagine you're at the local thing, assembly, where legal disputes are settled. Instead of calling expert witnesses or presenting physical evidence, you and your opponent take turns delivering elaborately crafted poetic insults, questioning each other's courage, sexual prowess, family lineage, and personal hygiene. The crowd judges whose verbal daggers cut deeper, whose metaphors were more creative, whose rhythm and wordplay demonstrated superior intelligence. The winner often won the case based on rhetorical skill alone. These weren't just playground-level taunts. Viking flighting was sophisticated verbal art, using complex alliteration, kennings, metaphorical compound expressions like calling the sea the whale road, and mythological references. A successful flighting performance demonstrated not just creativity, but deep cultural knowledge and quick thinking, qualities valued in Norse society. The insults themselves would make a modern HR department collectively faint. Common themes included accusations of cowardice in battle, sexual deviance, particularly accusations of being the passive partner in male homosexual encounters, which was considered shameful, and suggestions that one's opponent had intimate relations with various barnyard animals. Family members, particularly mothers, were not off limits. These insults were delivered not with crude directness, but with elaborate poetic flourish that might make Shakespeare's more colorful moments seem tame by comparison. The Norse gods themselves engaged in flighting. In one famous mythological example, Loki exchanges increasingly outrageous insults with the other deities at a feast, eventually going so far that he's captured and punished. Even Thor, not generally considered the wittiest of gods, participated in a verbal dueling when necessary. The consequences of losing a flighting contest could be severe. Beyond losing your legal case, you might suffer lasting reputation damage in a culture where honor was literally worth more than life. Some particularly devastating poetic insults became famous and would follow the recipient for years. This is where our concept of having the last word takes on literal legal significance. So, as modern courts require participants to remain silent and respectful, while legal professionals argue using precedent and statute, picture the Norse alternative, where your ability to craft a cutting poetic assessment of your opponent's personal shortcomings might determine whether you kept your land, paid compensation for damages, or even preserved your freedom. Your ninth grade English teacher was right. Poetry can be practical. Fact 4. Vikings skied into battle. Sometimes, when we picture Viking warriors, we typically imagine them disembarking from longships, axes and swords at the ready, perhaps wearing historically inaccurate horned helmets. What we don't envision is Vikings on skis, yet archaeological and literary evidence confirms that Norse warriors sometimes conducted military operations on what we now consider recreational equipment. Rock carvings dating back to 5000 BCE show that skiing was already well established in Scandinavia thousands of years before the Viking Age. By the time the Norse began their expansionist period, skis were standard transportation in winter conditions. The Norse goddess Skadi was associated with skiing and hunting, demonstrating the cultural importance of the practice. These weren't the high-tech, precisely engineered skis you might use at Aspen or Chamonix. Viking skis were wooden planks, often of different lengths, a longer ski for gliding and a shorter one for pushing, similar to modern skate skiing technique. Instead of relying on shaped edges for control, Norse skiers used a single long pole for balance and steering, planting it between their legs to brake or make turns. The military applications were significant in a region where deep snow could otherwise make winter movement nearly impossible. The famous Viking king Harald Hardrada reportedly maintained special units of ski troops for winter warfare. Picture the terror of defending against warriors who could appear seemingly from nowhere, gliding silently through snow-covered forests before attacking with the same berserker ferocity we typically associate with seaborne raids. In the 1200s, after the traditional Viking Age, a civil war in Norway featured a famous incident where Birkebeiner warriors skied over mountains through a blizzard to rescue the infant heir to the throne, carrying the future king to safety. This event is commemorated today in ski marathons in both Norway and the United States, with participants carrying weight representing a 2-year-old child. The ski warfare tradition established by the Vikings continued in Scandinavian military doctrine for centuries. During the Finnish-Soviet Winter War of 1939-1940, Finnish ski troops devastated much larger, mechanized Soviet units, showing that even in the age of tanks and aircraft, there were still military advantages to the ancient Norse practice of strapping boards to one's feet and gliding into battle. So, while you might associate skiing with hot chocolate, cozy lodges, and overpriced resort passes, remember that for Vikings, those wooden planks weren't just for recreation. They were serious military technology that could mean the difference between successful conquest and freezing to death in the unforgiving Nordic winter. The next time you see skiers racing downhill, reimagine them with axes and shields, screaming battle cries rather than on your left. Fact 5. Vikings had sophisticated legal codes for women's rights. Despite their reputation for brutality, Viking society featured remarkably progressive legal protections for women compared to many contemporaneous cultures. Women in Norse society couldn't participate directly in the thing assemblies, but they possessed legal rights that would have been unthinkable in much of Europe during the same period. Norse women could own property independently of their husbands. They could inherit property from both parents and spouses. They controlled their own dowries after marriage. Most significantly, they had the legal right to divorce their husbands for a variety of reasons that contemporary cultures would have dismissed, including domestic violence, public insult, or even the husband wearing clothing considered too feminine. Gender expression being strictly regulated for both sexes. The divorce procedure itself was straightforward by medieval standards. A woman wishing to divorce her husband needed only to declare her intention before witnesses at her front door and at the couple's bed, then state the grounds for separation. After this ritual declaration, the marriage was legally dissolved. She would typically retain her dowry and any property she had brought to the marriage. Financial independence after divorce was ensured through property division laws that were remarkably equitable. Property acquired during marriage was often divided according to who had brought what into the union, with provisions ensuring women weren't left destitute. Children typically remained with the father as they belonged to his family line, though exceptions existed depending on circumstances. Women could run businesses and farms independently, with archaeological and literary evidence showing female merchants, traders, and property managers. While they couldn't become warriors in the conventional sense, with some controversial exceptions currently debated by historians, women controlled the internal economy of the household, often managing complex agricultural operations, while men were away on raids or trading expeditions. Even in religion, women held significant positions. Female practitioners of cider, a form of Norse magic associated with telling and shaping the future, were both feared and respected. The vulva, a female seer or prophet, could wield considerable influence through her prophecies and rituals, with even kings seeking her counsel. These rights weren't perfect by modern standards. Severe limitations still existed, and social reality didn't always match legal theory. However, when a 10th century Norse woman could legally divorce her husband for slapping her and take half the family property, while a 19th century English woman had virtually no legal existence, independent of her spouse, the contrast becomes significant. The erosion of these rights occurred gradually with Christianization, as European legal concepts that treated women more explicitly as property rather than legal persons slowly replaced Norse traditions. By the late medieval period, many of the distinctive protections for women in Scandinavian law had been diminished or eliminated entirely. So, as you drift closer to sleep, consider this paradox. The same culture that produced fearsome raiders who terrorized European coastlines also developed legal protections for women's autonomy that wouldn't be restored in most Western societies until the 19th and 20th centuries. History, like human nature itself, rarely conforms to our desire for simple categorization into civilized and barbaric. Still resisting sleep's sweet embrace, I see my previous Viking facts haven't quite done the trick. Your insomnia is truly impressive. Perhaps you would have made an excellent night watchman in a Viking settlement, though the constant terror of potential raids might have eventually cured your sleeplessness permanently. Let's delve even deeper into the murky fjords of Norse history, with 6 more excruciatingly detailed facts about Viking life that you absolutely never needed to know. Pull your blankets a little closer, not because these facts are frightening, but because they might just bore you completely unconscious. And isn't that exactly what you're hoping for at this late hour? Fact 1. Viking blood eagles. Gruesome reality or medieval fake news. One of the most notorious aspects of Viking brutality in popular imagination is the so-called blood eagle execution, a ritual torture where the victim's ribs were allegedly separated from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings, with the lungs then drawn through the wounds to create a grisly eagle display. This horrifying image has captivated modern audiences through television shows, novels, and video games, reinforcing the stereotype of Vikings as uniquely sadistic in their violence. But here's where historical reality gets complicated. Despite its prominence in pop culture, the blood eagle remains one of the most contested topics among Viking scholars. The ritual is mentioned in several Old Norse sagas, primarily the tales of Ragnar Lodbrok and his sons. But these accounts were written centuries after the events they purport to describe, in an era when Christian writers often embellished tales of pagan brutality to highlight the civilizing influence of Christianity. The saga descriptions themselves are ambiguous. The Old Norse phrase rista örn a baki, to cut an eagle on someone's back, could be interpreted several ways, possibly referring to a pattern carved on the victim's back rather than the full, gruesome chest-opening procedure. Some scholars have suggested the accounts resulted from medieval writers misinterpreting symbolic poetic language as literal description. The anatomical feasibility of the blood eagle as commonly depicted is dubious. Separating ribs from the spine of a living person would be extraordinarily difficult, requiring substantial anatomical knowledge and specialized tools. The victim would likely die from shock very early in the procedure, making the elaborate display impossible to complete on a living subject, as the sagas sometimes suggest. No archaeological evidence has ever confirmed the practice, despite extensive excavations of Viking Age sites. No human remains show the distinctive skeletal trauma that would result from such a procedure. While absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, The lack of physical confirmation is noteworthy. Contemporary accounts from victims of Viking raids who had every reason to emphasize Norse cruelty never mention anything resembling the blood eagle. Frankish, Anglo-Saxon, and Irish chronicles detail Viking violence in considerable detail, but describe more conventional atrocities, killing, enslaving, and general pillaging rather than elaborate ritual torture. So, what's the most likely explanation? The blood eagle probably represents a complex tangle of mistranslation, poetic metaphor, and medieval Christian propaganda rather than an actual historical practice. The Viking Age concept of riding an eagle on someone's back might have referred to a simpler form of ritual scarification or a symbolic cutting that was later exaggerated in the literary tradition. However, this doesn't mean Vikings were peaceful. They engaged in the standard medieval repertoire of executions. Hanging, beheading, and drowning were all practiced. They conducted human sacrifice in religious contexts, as confirmed by both literary sources and archaeological evidence. They weren't exceptionally humane by modern standards, but the evidence suggests they weren't uniquely sadistic compared to their contemporaries either. The blood eagle myth serves as a perfect example of how our understanding of Viking culture has been shaped by sources far removed from the actual events, filtered through layers of cultural bias, misunderstanding, and deliberate exaggeration. The image of Norse raiders as exceptionally bloodthirsty savages served particular narrative purposes for medieval Christian writers and continues to capture modern imaginations precisely because it's so shockingly extreme. As you ponder this while drifting toward sleep, consider how historical reality is often more nuanced and complex than the vivid, simplified images that survive in popular consciousness. The Vikings were neither noble savages nor uniquely cruel monsters, just humans operating within their cultural context, capable of both remarkable achievements and terrible violence, much like people in any era. Fact 2. Viking board games were surprisingly sophisticated and occasionally fatal. When not engaged in farming, trading, or raiding, Vikings spent considerable time playing board games, not as casual entertainment, but as serious intellectual exercises with social, religious, and sometimes lethal implications. Archaeological evidence reveals a gaming culture of surprising sophistication, with multiple games requiring complex strategic thinking. The most prominent Viking board game was Hnefatafl, roughly pronounced Nefatafl, a strategy game often called Viking chess, though it predates chess in Northern Europe by centuries. Unlike chess with its symmetrical forces, Hnefatafl is fundamentally asymmetrical. One player controls a king piece, and his defenders trying to reach the edges of the board, while the other commands a larger force attempting to capture the king. Archaeological finds reveal Hnefatafl boards, ranging from simple grids scratched into wooden planks to elaborate tables with inlaid playing surfaces of bone, amber, or precious metals. Playing pieces were carved from walrus ivory, antler, bone, or stone, often with considerable artistic detail. Some high-status burials contain complete game sets, suggesting their importance as status symbols and valuable possessions that should accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The game's asymmetrical nature reflects Viking cultural values and perhaps their understanding of real-world conflict. The defender's goal of protecting a central figure against superior numbers mirrors shield wall tactics used to protect chieftains in battle. The attacker's challenge of coordinating larger forces to surround and trap a more mobile opponent reflects actual military problems faced during raids or larger campaigns. Beyond Tafel, archaeological evidence reveals other board games in the Viking repertoire. Finds from the Ballandary Crannog in Ireland include a board for a game similar to Nine Men's Morris or Murals, a strategy game still played today. Dice made from bone, antler, or occasionally amber appear in numerous archaeological contexts, suggesting various games of chance complemented the more strategic board games. Literary sources suggest gaming had significant cultural importance beyond mere recreation. The Voluspa, an Old Norse poem containing the Norse creation myth, specifically mentions the gods playing board games in their golden age, before the coming of discord and ultimately Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse. After the world's destruction and rebirth, the gods find the same gaming pieces again, suggesting cosmic continuity through the medium of board games. Games also served important social functions. Skill at board games demonstrated intelligence and strategic thinking, qualities valued in potential leaders. Gaming sessions provided opportunities for social bonding, especially during the long winter months when outdoor activities were limited. They created contexts for nonviolent competition and status negotiation within the community. However, Viking gaming could turn deadly serious. The sagas contain numerous accounts of arguments over games escalating into violence and even killing. The 13th century Grettis saga describes a dispute over a board game that results in one player striking another with the Nefatafel board, leading to a blood feud that claims multiple lives. While such literary accounts may be exaggerated, they suggest that gaming disputes could trigger serious conflict in a culture where honor was paramount. Archaeological evidence occasionally supports these literary hints about the seriousness of gaming. A partial Hnefatafel board from Wymos, Denmark shows signs of having been deliberately broken before being deposited in a bog, possibly representing a ritualized killing of a gaming board involved in some dispute or associated with a deceased owner. The strategic complexity of Viking board games challenges simplistic views of Norse culture as primarily physical rather than intellectual. The abstract thinking required for success at Hnefatafel, calculating possible moves several turns ahead, understanding spatial relationships, and adapting strategy to an opponent's tactics, demonstrates sophisticated cognitive abilities that would translate to other domains like trade negotiations, legal proceedings, and military planning. So, as you lie there, contemplating your next move toward unconsciousness, imagine Vikings gathered around a Hnefatafel board during the depths of winter. The stakes of the game, perhaps involving more than mere pride, their faces illuminated by flickering firelight as they contemplate their next moves with an intensity that modern casual gaming rarely matches. These weren't just games to pass the time, but serious intellectual exercises that developed and demonstrated skills directly relevant to survival in the challenging Norse world. Fact 3. Vikings had surprisingly elaborate concepts of the afterlife. Far from the simplistic die in battle and go to Valhalla notion that pervades popular culture, Viking concepts of the afterlife were remarkably complex, with multiple possible destinations determined by manner of death, social status, moral behavior, and personal allegiance to specific deities. This sophisticated cosmology reflected the complexity of Norse society itself and addressed very human concerns about what happens after death. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was indeed one possible afterlife destination, but it was far more specific than commonly portrayed. Ruled by Odin, this martial paradise was reserved primarily for elite warriors who died in battle. These chosen warriors, called Einherjar, would feast and fight each day in preparation for Ragnarok, when they would battle alongside the gods against the forces of chaos. However, only half of those slain in battle went to Valhalla. The other half were claimed by the goddess Freya for her realm of Folkvanger, for reasons not entirely clear in surviving sources. Most Norse people, being farmers rather than warriors, would never qualify for these martial afterlives. For ordinary people, the primary afterlife destination was Helheim, ruled by the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. Despite sharing etymological roots with the Christian Hell, Helheim wasn't a place of punishment, but simply the default destination for those who died of illness, old age, or other non-violent causes. What Norse sources call straw death, dying on one's bed of straw rather than in battle. Descriptions of Helheim vary, but it's generally portrayed as a muted reflection of the living world rather than a place of torment. The deceased would continue a form of existence similar to their earthly life, though perhaps less vibrant. Archaeological evidence of grave goods, everyday tools, personal possessions, and sometimes food and drink suggests belief that the dead would need these items in their afterlife, regardless of which realm they inhabited. Beyond these major destinations, specialized afterlives existed for particular cases. Those who drowned at sea were thought to be taken by the goddess Ran, who caught sailors in her net and brought them to her underwater hall. This wasn't necessarily viewed as a terrible fate. Ran was said to treat her guests well, though sailors naturally preferred to avoid her invitation as long as possible. Some sources suggest different afterlife destinations based on craft or profession. The Eyrbyggja saga describes a vision of a mountain opening to receive a group of recently drowned fishermen, with their deceased relatives welcoming them and preparing a feast. This suggests the possibility of family-based or occupation-based afterlife communities rather than universal realms. The concept of moral judgment in determining afterlife destination appears inconsistently in Norse sources, while Valhalla and Folkvanger were selective based on manner of death rather than moral virtue. Some accounts suggest the existence of Nastrond, a shore of corpses where oath breakers, murderers, and adulterers would suffer punishment after death. This realm, featuring a hall made from serpents dripping venom on the inhabitants, bears more resemblance to punitive afterlife concepts from other religions and may reflect Christian influence on later Norse sources. Archaeological evidence offers intriguing glimpses of how these beliefs manifested in funeral practices. Ship burials, where the deceased was interred in an actual vessel or symbolic stone ship setting, suggest the concept of a journey to the afterlife requiring transportation. The practice of including functional tools, weapons, and personal possessions indicates belief in continuity between earthly activities and afterlife existence. Animal sacrifices accompanying human burials might represent provisions for the journey or companions for the afterlife. The varied nature of Viking burial practices, cremation, inhumation, ship burial, mound burial, flat ground cemetery interment, might reflect different conceptions of the afterlife journey or destination. Regional variations in funeral customs suggest that afterlife beliefs weren't uniform across the Norse world, but adapted to local traditions and perhaps individual family preferences. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Norse afterlife concepts was the emphasis on remembrance by the living, the creation of rune stones commemorating the deceased, the recitation of their deeds at funerals and feasts, and the maintenance of ancestral burial mounds, all point to a culture where being remembered was itself a form of immortality. Fame never dies for the one who achieves it well, states the Havamal, a collection of Old Norse wisdom poetry, suggesting that reputation among the living constituted a form of afterlife as important as any supernatural realm. As Christianity gradually replaced Norse paganism, these complex afterlife concepts didn't simply disappear, but underwent syncretism with Christian ideas. Some Viking Age grave goods show mixtures of pagan and Christian symbolism, suggesting individuals hedging their afterlife bets during the transitional period. Certain aspects of pre-Christian funeral customs persisted well into the officially Christian era, particularly in rural areas, indicating the deep roots of these traditional conceptions. So, as your consciousness begins to fade toward sleep, that temporary little death we experience each night, consider how the Vikings faced the ultimate unknown with a rich tapestry of possibilities rather than a single simplified afterlife. Their cosmology acknowledged the diversity of human lives and deaths, offering multiple potential destinations that reflected their complex society and the very human hope that death might not be an ending, but a transition. Fact 4. Viking timekeeping was surprisingly sophisticated, but would drive you mad. Without phones, watches, or even mechanical clocks, Vikings developed a remarkably functional timekeeping system that served their practical needs while reflecting their unique conception of time's passage. Their approach combined careful observation of natural phenomena with cultural frameworks that would seem alien to our modern, precisely regimented experience of hours and minutes. The Viking day was divided not into 24 equal hours, but into 8 uneven divisions called eikt, singular, or eiktir, plural. Each eikt lasted approximately 3 hours, but varied seasonally with daylight length. These divisions were identified by their relationship to the sun's position and daily activities rather than abstract numerical values. Dawn, mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon, evening, and so forth were marked by the sun's position relative to landscape features or by routine activities like meal times. This flexible system meant that time, as experienced, expanded and contracted with the seasons. Summer hours were longer than winter ones, reflecting the natural rhythm of daylight in northern latitudes. The extreme seasonal variation in daylight at northern latitudes, ranging from nearly 24 hours of summer daylight to just a few hours in winter, made rigid equal-hour divisions impractical. For daytime orientation, the position of the sun relative to fixed landscape features provided reasonably accurate guidance. Evidence suggests that certain farm buildings and settlement layouts were intentionally aligned to serve as rough sundials, with shadows falling on particular spots to indicate specific times of day. The Old Norse term hadegi, high day, specifically referred to the sun's highest point, equivalent to noon. Nighttime orientation relied primarily on star positions. The Old Norse night rider, Notrida, was likely a form of nocturnal sundial using stars rather than the sun, though details of its operation remain speculative. Literary sources mention the ability to tell time at night by observing stellar positions, a crucial skill for navigation during the dark months of the northern winter. The Viking week initially consisted of just 5 days, later expanded to 7 under the influence of Roman and eventually Christian calendar systems. Each day was named after a deity or cosmic force. Tyr's Day, Tuesday; Odin's Day, Wednesday; Thor's Day, Thursday; Frigg's Day, Friday; Washing Day, Saturday; Sunday, Sunday; and Moon Day, Monday. This naming convention survives in modern English and Scandinavian day names. The year was divided into just 2 seasons, summer and winter, rather than the 4 we commonly recognize. The summer began with the first day, when the sun's shadow, cast by a specific vertical marker, reached a predetermined point, a moment celebrated with the festival of summer finding, Sumarmal. Winter similarly had its official starting point, Veternatjar, determined by observation rather than fixed calendar date. For longer time reckoning, Vikings used a lunisolar calendar that reconciled lunar months with the solar year through a complex system of intercalation. adding extra days or months. The calendar needed regular adjustment to keep the named months roughly aligned with their expected seasons. This adjustment responsibility fell to the law speaker, an official who would declare when extra days should be added to maintain seasonal alignment. What made this system particularly challenging was the absence of standardization across the Norse world. Local variations in methods for determining time created a situation where 3 o'clock might occur at noticeably different times in settlements, even relatively close to each other. This wasn't problematic in a society where most people never traveled far from their birthplace, but it could create confusion during regional gatherings. The most fascinating aspect of Viking timekeeping was its social dimension. The passing of time was often marked communally through recognized activities rather than abstract measurement. Meal times, work periods, religious observances, and community gatherings provided temporal landmarks that organized daily and seasonal experience. Time was something collectively experienced and validated rather than individually measured. This relationship with time reflected deeper cultural values. Time was cyclical rather than purely linear. In Norse thought, the yearly round of seasonal festivals, agricultural activities, and trading or raiding periods created a rhythm of recurring patterns rather than a straight progression from past to futures. This cyclical conception appeared in Norse mythology as well, with the world itself moving through cycles of creation, destruction, and rebirth. The practical implications of Viking timekeeping would drive modern schedulers to despair. Arranging a meeting for mid-morning might result in people arriving over a span of hours rather than minutes. Long-distance coordination was nearly impossible without sending messengers carrying standardized time references. Planning activities required flexibility and adaptability rather than rigid adherence to precise schedules. Yet, despite these limitations by modern standards, the system worked remarkably well for Viking society's needs. Agricultural activities, religious observances, legal proceedings, and daily routines operated smoothly within this flexible framework. The system's adaptability to seasonal variation was actually an advantage in the extreme northern environment, allowing work patterns to naturally expand during the abundant summer daylight and contract during the dark winter months. So, as you lie there checking the precise digital time display one last time before sleep, consider how differently your Norse ancestors experienced time's passage, not as the tyrannical march of identical minutes, but as a flowing river of variable width and current, marked not by abstract numbers, but by the sun's dance across recognizable landmarks, the familiar patterns of daily activities, and the communal rhythm of a society attuned to natural cycles rather than mechanical precision. Fact 5. Viking medical treatments combined surprising effectiveness with pure psychological torture. Norse medical practices combined practical techniques based on generations of observed effectiveness with ritual elements that, by modern standards, would constitute psychological horror. This blend of the practical and the magico-religious created a medical system that was simultaneously more effective than many contemporary European approaches in some ways, while being utterly terrifying in others. Archaeological evidence reveals that Vikings possessed a surprisingly diverse medical toolkit. Excavations have yielded surgical instruments, including knives, saws, forceps, needles, and probes, often made with considerable precision from iron, bronze, or bone. These weren't crude implements, but specialized tools designed for specific medical purposes, suggesting a developed tradition of surgical intervention. The most impressive Viking medical achievement was cranial surgery. Multiple skulls from the Viking Age show evidence of trepanation, the deliberate creation of holes in the skull, with surrounding bone growth indicating that patients survived the procedure, often for years afterward. This dangerous surgery was likely performed to relieve pressure from head injuries or treat severe headaches and seizures. The survival rate appears surprisingly high, given the absence of modern antiseptic techniques. For wound treatment, archaeological and literary evidence indicates that Vikings used honey, which has proven antibacterial properties, and certain molds that naturally produce antibiotic compounds, essentially a prehistoric version of penicillin, discovered through observation and tradition rather than laboratory science. Plant-based salves, combining antimicrobial herbs with animal fats, provided effective topical treatments for minor wounds and skin conditions. Linen bandages appear frequently in medical contexts, suggesting systematic wound wrapping rather than haphazard coverage. The sagas describe healers examining wounds to assess whether they penetrated body cavities, a critical diagnostic approach still relevant in modern trauma assessment. Some accounts mention probing wounds with leek stalks, which have mild antimicrobial properties, to check depth and severity. Bone setting developed into a sophisticated practice, judging from the archaeological record. Numerous well-healed fractures indicate that Norse healers could successfully treat broken bones. Splints made from wood and bandages maintained proper bone alignment during healing. The sagas describe techniques for reducing dislocations that closely resemble modern methods. Where Viking medicine diverges most dramatically from modern practice is in its integration of ritual and psychological elements. Many medical procedures included invocations to specific gods associated with healing, particularly air, a goddess specifically connected to medical arts, but also Odin, who had particular knowledge of herbs and healing magic. These weren't mere superstitious additions, but integral components of treatment that provided psychological comfort and possibly placebo effects that enhanced recovery. Some treatment methods cross the line from modern medical understanding into what we would consider psychological torture, though they were performed with healing intent. The sagas describe treatment for seizures that involved partially burying the patient in a freshly dug grave with specific ritual foods, a terrifying experience designed to drive out the supernatural entities believed to cause the condition. For certain mental disturbances, treatments included exposing the patient to extreme situations intended to shock them back to normalcy, sudden immersions in cold water, frightening encounters staged by Confederates, or isolation in unfamiliar settings. While traumatizing by modern standards, these approaches reflect an understanding that psychological states could sometimes be shifted through intense experiences. Pain management relied primarily on alcohol and certain plant-derived substances with sedative properties. Henbane, mandrake, and opium poppies were known in the Viking world, though their use appears to have been limited and carefully controlled due to their dangerous side effects. Some scholars have suggested that the berserker rage reportedly experienced by certain Viking warriors might have been facilitated by deliberate consumption of mind-altering substances, possibly including Amanita muscaria mushrooms. Surgery without effective anesthesia was, of course, extraordinarily painful. The sagas sometimes describe patients biting on leather straps or wooden sticks during procedures, but largely suggest that stoic endurance of pain was expected. The cultural emphasis on courage and endurance in Norse society extended to medical contexts, where demonstrating fortitude during painful treatments was considered honorable. Perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of Viking medicine was its integral connection to fate. The Norse concept of Weird, fate or destiny, created a medical mindset where intervention was attempted, but ultimate outcomes were understood to be predetermined. This paradoxical approach, fighting against illness or injury, while simultaneously accepting that the outcome might already be decided by greater forces, created a medical culture that never stopped trying while remaining prepared for failure. Pregnancy and childbirth received special attention in Norse medicine. Archaeological and literary evidence suggests specialized knowledge of herbs to ease childbirth pain, reduce bleeding, and treat various gynecological conditions. The goddess Frigg was especially associated with childbirth, and elaborate ritual preparations accompanied birth to protect both mother and child from supernatural harm. The effectiveness of Viking medical practices varied dramatically. Some approaches, like honey for wound treatment, certain herbal preparations, and bone-setting techniques, had genuine therapeutic value. Others, particularly those involving magical elements, likely operated primarily through psychological mechanisms rather than direct physiological effects. Still others, like consuming toxic substances for certain conditions, probably caused more harm than good. So, as your consciousness begins to drift toward sleep, imagine being treated for a severe headache in the Viking Age, your head partially shaved, a skilled practitioner carefully cutting away a small section of your skull with iron tools while reciting invocations to Air and Odin, as family members hold you still and offer encouragement to demonstrate proper Norse courage in the face of excruciating pain. Neither modern medical bills nor waiting room times seem quite so terrible by comparison, do they? Fact 6. Viking art was deliberately disorienting and possibly designed to induce altered states. The swirling, interlaced animal forms of Viking art aren't just decorative patterns, but potentially constitute a sophisticated visual technology designed to induce specific psychological states. Far from being merely ornamental, Norse artistic traditions may have served as tools for spiritual transformation, cultural messaging, and perhaps even preparation for trance states associated with certain religious practices. The most distinctive Viking artistic style, often called the animal style or gripping beast, features interwoven animal bodies twisted into complex knots with limbs that grasp neighboring figures. Unlike classical art traditions that prioritize clarity and symmetry, Norse art deliberately challenges visual perception through ambiguity, transformation, and optical illusion. Animals morph into other creatures, positive and negative space reverse unexpectedly, and multiple reading paths create visual uncertainty. Archaeological evidence reveals these complex designs on everything from monumental stone carvings to personal items like combs, brooches, and sword hilts. The ubiquity of these visually complex patterns suggests they held significant cultural importance beyond mere decoration. Particularly elaborate examples appear on objects associated with religious or ceremonial contexts, suggesting connections to spiritual practices. The perceptual effects of viewing these designs, particularly in the flickering firelight that would have illuminated them in Viking Age settings, include mild visual disorientation and difficulty tracking individual elements through the pattern. Experimental archaeology suggests that extended contemplation of these designs, while in the low light conditions of a Viking hall, could induce mild altered states similar to meditative trance. This disorienting quality connects to Norse religious practices involving Seder, a form of magic associated with prophecy, fate manipulation, and spiritual journeying. Literary sources describe practitioners, typically women called vulva, entering trance states to access supernatural knowledge or influence events. The visual stimulation from contemplating complex interlace patterns may have facilitated entering these altered consciousness states. The animal motifs themselves weren't randomly selected, but represented specific symbolic values and powers. Wolves and ravens connected to Odin and warrior culture. Serpents symbolized liminal boundaries and transformation. Bears represented elite warrior status and berserker rage. The intertwining of these figures created not just aesthetic patterns, but narrative elements and power combinations comprehensible to those versed in the symbolic language. Beyond spiritual applications, Viking art served practical psychological functions in warrior culture. The disorienting visual effects of animal interlace, decorated on shields, helmets, and sword hilts, may have been designed to momentarily confuse opponents in battle, creating split-second advantages. Experimental reconstructions suggest that shield patterns featuring certain spiral designs create optical illusions that make it difficult to judge the shield's exact distance and angle during combat movements. The psychological impact extended to political messaging as well. Leaders commissioned increasingly elaborate artwork, displaying their connection to specific deities, mythological narratives, or ancestral figures. The complexity and quality of the artwork demonstrated not just wealth, but access to skilled craftspeople, a form of conspicuous consumption that reinforced social hierarchy through visual culture. What makes Viking art particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is its refusal to provide visual resolution. Unlike many artistic traditions that guide the eye toward central focal points or clear narrative sequences, Norse designs frequently deny visual closure, keeping the viewer's perception in a state of constant adjustment. This perceptual ambiguity mirrors the ambiguous nature of Norse mythology itself, with its shape-shifting figures and morally complex deities. The interlace patterns also embodied philosophical concepts central to Norse worldview, particularly ideas about fate, interconnection, and the binding nature of oaths and obligations. The Old Norse term, wired, roughly translating as fate, but encompassing broader concepts of cause and effect through time, was conceptualized as threads connecting events and individuals. The visual representation of interweaving strands in art made this abstract concept tangible and omnipresent in daily visual experience. As Christianity gradually replaced Norse paganism, these artistic traditions underwent fascinating transformation rather than simple replacement. Early Christian art in Scandinavia incorporated traditional interlace patterns into crosses and biblical scenes, creating syncretic visual expressions that allowed cultural continuity while accommodating new religious content. The psychological impact of these familiar patterns likely eased the transition between religious systems. The legacy of this visually complex tradition continues in modern Scandinavian design, though transformed through centuries of evolution. The emphasis on intricate detail, natural forms, and visual complexity connects ancient runestones to modern Scandinavian artistic expressions. The psychological principles underlying Viking visual culture, the balance between order and complexity, the careful management of visual tension, remain relevant in contemporary design theory. So, as your eyes grow heavy and your visual processing begins to surrender to sleep, imagine how differently your Viking ancestors experienced their visual environment, surrounded by intricate designs, deliberately crafted to create uncertainty, transformation, and liminality, all illuminated by flickering firelight that enhanced these effects through constant motion and shadow play. Their visual world wasn't just aesthetically rich, but psychologically active, engaging perception in ways most modern environments, with their emphasis on clarity and immediate comprehension, rarely attempt. So, as you drift gently into sleep, remember, your modern inconveniences pale compared to waking up with livestock roommates, manual labor that never ends, and healthcare involving leeches. Rest easy, friend. Grateful that goats, at least now, mostly live outdoors. Your temperature-controlled bedroom, with its memory foam mattress and Egyptian cotton sheets, would seem like Valhalla itself to your Viking ancestors. who huddled under scratchy wool blankets on straw pallets while smoke from the central hearth stung their eyes and gradually blackened their lungs. Your morning alarm may be annoying, but at least it's not a rooster screaming existential dread directly into your soul at the first hint of dawn. When you wake and shuffle to your bathroom, that miracle of modern plumbing, take a moment to appreciate that you don't need to venture outside to a frost-covered outhouse or simply find a convenient bush. Your shower, with its instantly available hot water, performs a function that would have required hours of hauling and heating water in the Viking Age. And your toothbrush accomplishes more in 2 minutes than a chewed twig could in a lifetime. Your breakfast, whether elaborate or simple, contains ingredients from around the world, preserved by modern methods and untouched by weevils, rats, or mold. Luxuries beyond imagining for people whose winter diet consisted largely of dried meat, aged cheese, and bread so hard it could double as a weapon in emergency. Even your most tedious workday involves comforts that would seem magical to your ancestors. Light without fire, climate control at the touch of a button, instant communication across vast distances, and the ability to access virtually all human knowledge through the device in your pocket. Your worst commute is a dream compared to trudging miles through mud or snow, always alert for wolves, bandits, or simply treacherous terrain that could mean injury, far from help. The modern world has its problems, certainly, but tonight, as sleep claims you, perhaps the thought of what you've avoided by being born in this time, rather than the Viking Age, will bring a smile to your face and a deeper appreciation for even the most mundane aspects of your comfortable, goat-free existence. Good night, and remember, whenever modern life seems challenging, at least you're not a Viking.